Hello, everyone. I am James Porticos of Pearl, and it is a pleasure to be your moderator to today's Agony Expert series. And in behalf of our CEO, Natasha McLeverian, our guest expert, as well as the whole Pearl team, we welcome you to our Agony Expert series. We could start with all of us going into the Zoom, and I've seen some of the names already being reflected and sharing your names and where you are dialing from. It's always interesting to know you're joined by people across different parts and geographies of the globe. And we will also be making use of this chat box. If you have questions, if you want our guest expert to answer later on, this is where you will post these questions away. Apart from the fact that you can also unmute yourselves and ask your questions straight away later on. In this Agony Expert, we venture to ask the question if we as people and as leaders think we are fit to handle complexity. You'll find out from our expert whose specialty is working with complexity. So, for those who have joined us for the first time, the agony expert originated from the concept of agony aunt, who, by definition, is a person who writes a column in a newspaper or a magazine in which the person replies to the readers who have written for advice on their personal problems. We thought it a fitting title to use agony expert as you folks, our audience, will have access to expert insights. And what's nice about this is you can see in the slide, you can pick and choose from a range of sessions this August, cutting across 8 categories delivered by 17 world-class experts in today's industry. And today's session is all about pause, navigating complexity. And we're honored to have the expert Sonja Blignaut, thinking partner and founder of MoreBeyond. And she's been working in the fields of narrative and complexity in 2002, since 2002. And we'll soon hear her talk us through navigating complexity, working with mega problems, plus lots more. And this is what we do in People as an organization. We help companies drive organizational excellence across several domains and topics, as you can see on the slide. We match your needs with vast network of experts, offering curated solutions, either mainstream, cutting edge, or both. Domains of expertise you can see in the next slide are across people, digital innovation, change management, and so many others. So just a quick run through of what's going to happen today. We have Sonia to address the group for approximately 20 minutes, followed by Q&A with you for another 20 minutes. And then we will go and wrap things up for you in the last remaining 5 minutes of the event. Again, please remember to post your questions in the chat box so we can address these in the Q&A portion. And without further ado, I now hand over the floor to Sonia.
Thank you so much, James, and it's such a pleasure to be here. I think I'm just going to jump straight into the presentation. I hear I've got 20 minutes now and not 25, so I'm going to have to be quick. And please help me keep time, James. It really is such an honor for me to be here, and I'm really looking forward to this. I think other than most people, complexity is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So as James said, I've been working in this field for almost two decades. And over that time, I've just become more and more convinced, that complexity is an important topic for all of us to understand, not only in our professional lives, but also in our personal lives. So I'll just jump straight into it, maybe just a little bit more about who is MoreBeyond and who I am. So we are sense-making partners and wayfinders. And you'll see I've got ways finders, because in complexity, there's never only one way. One of the things that I love about complexity is, there's so many different options. There are so many it's like a tangled web. And so there's always more than one way through. And so if you're lost or stuck or curious, then, we are essentially the people that can partner with you. And it's also a founding member of a new organization called Sense-Making Partners. And you'll see some of the imagery that's on screen. We very much believe that we are a bit in uncharted territory at the moment. We are, the disruption even before the pandemic. Things have already become more complex, more uncertain. And many of us find ourselves in a space where our old ways of being, our existing tools and best practices are no longer serving us. And I feel that is where complexity really, offers some keys, not necessarily answers, but maybe new questions for us to think about and to help us get unstuck. So what we'll be exploring today, 5 main questions. So we're going to be looking at what the key capabilities are to successfully navigate complexity. We're going to dive a little bit into complexity fitness and how we enable that. A little bit about thinking about change, the role of stories, and then also how we optimize organizational structures to maximize adaptability. And I don't have a lot of time, so I'll kind of be skimming over the surface. But please do put your questions in the chat if there's anything that you'd like to kind of go into a bit deeper. So I'm going to start off, and I'm going to combine the first 2 questions, looking at the key capabilities and how we enable complexity fitness, because these 2 things are linked. But before we go there, I just wanted to check that, everybody understands what I mean when I speak about complexity. Sometimes people tend to think that complexity is almost like a higher order complicatedness. So it's a higher order difficulty. People would say, I've got a complex mathematical problem, for example. And in our language, that is not the meaning that we hold to complexity. So I like to go back to the root words and contrast these 2 words, complicated and complex. And as you can see on screen, that word plik in complicated means folded. So as in that image, you can see it's quite a complicated fold. It's almost like an origami fold. But even still, I can unfold it. I can completely understand it. I can refold it, and I can replicate it. So a complicated problem or a complicated system can be fully understood. We can solve those problems. It's a world that we've inhabited and that MBAs, prepare us for, and that we're very used to being in. Complex, on the other hand, plex means tangled. And you can't really untangle it. What's on screen there are the neurons in your brain. So I can't untangle the neurons in order to understand consciousness or to understand how your brain works. For me to be able to do that, I would have to kill you. And it's the same, for example, with an ecosystem. So complexity is about messy entanglements. It's about things being connected in ways we can't fully understand. And these problems that present there, some people like to call them wicked problems. They are more like patterns that we can shift and not really problems that we can solve. And so one of the key things to understand is that the more interconnected the world becomes, the more complex it becomes. And that is why, acronyms, for example, like VUCA has become so fashionable over the last decade or so, because we've had this felt sense of the complexity and the uncertainty increasing even prior to the pandemic. So what do we need? What are the key capabilities? And at the moment, I'm exploring 3 main areas of capabilities that I believe is really important for us to understand when we are, or if we want to navigate complexity. And the first is sensibility. It's the ability to make sense of our context, but also to sense into our own responses, to become aware of our own responses to that context. And this is about being situationally aware. It's for example, when we are navigating traffic, we are navigating complexity, but we need to be aware. We need to be able to sense patterns. We need to be able to sense what the other drivers are doing. So this idea of sensibility, and especially in an organization, very often this lies at the front lines, at the edges of your organization. So one of the key questions is, how do we enable that? Because many of those people in some organizations have been taught not to think, and we tend not to listen to them when they do make us aware of something. Then the second one that's equally as important, and these are all interconnected also, is responsibility. We know the word responsibility, But the problem is in many organizations, this has almost become synonymous with, if something goes wrong, who's to blame? It's taken on responsibility, accountability. All of these words have taken on meanings that's more related to compliance almost than to anything else. In complexity, I believe we need to be response able. So once we've sensed and we understand what kind of a system we're in, what is going on in our context, then we need the ability to respond appropriately. And the key distinction here is not to react. So I've been working with a friend of mine who's really, an expert in mindfulness. And it's really important for us to be able to manage our own responses, manage our nervous system responses, because sometimes being in complex and uncertain environments can generate anxiety. And for us to be able to respond, not react, and to respond appropriately. Because if we apply, for example, complicated systems approaches in complexity, sometimes we create unintended consequences. And then the third one is evolvability. This is a term that comes from biology, but this is essentially the ability of a system to maintain its adaptive capacity. And here we look at things like, do you have redundancy in the system? Do you have enough diversity? Are you able to be resilient so that you are able to evolve when the context around you shifts? And so these three buckets, I think, are the three capabilities that we need to look at developing in our organizations, in our leaders, and also in our employees. And then shifting across into complexity fitness, and this is already the start of enabling complexity fitness. But in complexity fitness, we've been doing a lot of work in how do we create workforces that are fit for complexity? How do we build this capability, the capacity in people in our organizations? And I think just to say here, it's never only about the people. We need to create structures. One of my favorite sayings is, it's hard to survive in the jungle if you were trained in the zoo. So we need to look at enabling people with jungle skills, but then also we need to look at the structures. And we're going to get there a little bit later. But so here we've identified, or we've been playing around with 4 meta skills, and you'll see there's a new logo at the bottom of the screen. This is something I'm doing in partnership with a friend of mine. We've created a brand called Complexity Fit. And we've identified these 4, what we're calling meta skills. So they are skills that help you acquire other skills. So courage, sometimes, for example, we need to make decisions when we don't feel we've got enough information. And we need to head into the unknown, like a surfer, going into the water. And sometimes this takes courage. It's not necessarily scary or negative, but it's not something that we're used to. We like to know, we like to have certainty. Second one is openness. And this is openness to diversity, openness to different perspectives, openness to learning and not knowing. So things like curiosity, for example, would sit under openness. Observation. So am I able to observe my context? Can I get a balcony perspective, as Ron Heifetz said in his book, and not always just be in the freneticness of the dance on the dance floor, if I take that metaphor. And then the last one is my favorite, it's lightness. Can we adopt a playful attitude? Can we hold our own opinions lightly? Can we embrace beauty and art, even in business? One of my favorite things to do is to challenge executives, for example, by reflecting on poetry, bringing that ambiguity, but also the sense of lightness. So these are the meta skills, and you'll see just in the ocean there, we've got some of the skills that's linked to them. And some of what we do in organizations is we try and convince people to send all of their people, not only the leadership teams, but everybody, to be taught how to reconnect with these skills. Because if you look at those, curiosity, playfulness, all of these kinds of skills are skills we had when we were children. So in a way, becoming complexity fit is almost going back to some of these skills that we knew before and that we apply in our normal everyday lives, but when we get into the workplace, we tend to forget about. So the third question is how we should think about change. And I want to start with a quote. So this is Heraclitus. that no man ever steps into the same river twice, for it's not the same river and it's not the same man. And I've been very interested in how biologists have started to shift from looking at organisms and ecosystems as things to looking at them as processes and flows. And if you can see yourself and the organization and the human systems that you are in as flow systems, then how we see change completely changes. So in the past, we've kind of seen change as something that happens to us. It's outside of us. It's something that we manage. It's something that we can resist. We've made change this thing. And if you look at it like this, then change to a large extent is life. So this is another quote by Peter Allen, who says complex systems like ecosystems, societies, cities, organizations, they only exist as flows of energy and matter. So we exist as flows through time and space. And that means that if we're part of flow systems, then change is necessary. Change is life. The moment change stops, it's the same way, with a river. When a river stops flowing, it dies. And so we need to completely change how we think about change. And we need to understand that uncertainty, instability, and being in flux is normal. I think now with the pandemic, many people, you hear the word normal come up a lot. When are we going back to normal? What is the next normal? And I think that is code word for when are we going back to certainty, predictability, and stability? And I think what we need to understand is that those things, stability and predictability, they are not normal. They tend to be temporary. So we need to befriend uncertainty. We need to reconnect. We need to create a new relationship with uncertainty. And so we need to think about change resilience and not necessarily change management. And this is very similar to complexity fitness. It's a way of being. It's understanding that change is something that's normal. Our bodies are changing all the time. So how do we step into the flow of change? How do we create workforces where people know that they will need to adapt continuously? That is a key question, and I don't necessarily have the answer. I think that very much depends on the existing culture and where these people are. But I think this is a key thing for us to consider. The fourth and the second last question is the role of stories. And the way that we see stories is, they are primary meaning-making devices for humans in these complex human systems. So if I want to understand what is going on below the surface, if I want to understand what the culture looks like, if I want to understand, for example, how do I create change resilience, or how do I enable a workforce to be response able, to create psychological safety, all of these things that we need, the best way to understand what the system currently looks like and what it's ready for or not ready for is to map the landscape of narrative. What are the stories that people are sharing around the water cooler? What are they saying around this organization? Because culture emerges from our interactions and from our stories. So here, a key question would be, what does your narrative ecology look like? Yanis Gabriel wrote wonderful academic papers on narrative ecologies. And so sometimes they look like monocultures. All the stories are similar. It's different stories aren't really allowed. And this creates a system that's not particularly resilient. So how do we create narrative ecologies where difference and diversity is celebrated, and we've got stories that's more like a wildflower garden? That's another question that keeps me occupied and curious. And then the final question I wanted to touch on, and sorry that I'm going so quickly, I just kind of want to go through all 5 of these, and then we can explore with your own questions, is how do we organize for adaptability? And I think here, the key thing that we need to consider is just how our companies are currently structured. So they are not really structured in ways that supports adaptability. And if I go back to my zoo jungle metaphor, many of our organizations look more like zoos where people are placed in categories. We call them silos, and they're very particular flows, defined flows between them. And I think we need a new design paradigm. And when I say this, it's not about demonizing the hierarchy. Hierarchies are natural in human systems. There's hierarchies even exist in natural systems. It's around the ability for that hierarchy to remain fluid and adaptive. So how do we maintain fluid hierarchies? And here I love to go to physics. So this is the constructal law in physics. The images in the background, that is what flow systems look like in natural systems. And you'll see they all follow this branching pattern. And what I love about this constructal law, I use it as a metaphor. I'm not saying it necessarily applies to human systems, but it says given freedom, flow systems will generate better and better configurations to flow more easily. And the key phrase here for me is given freedom. And so a question that I have is, are our systems free to evolve their own structures? What do we need to do? What scaffolding do we need to put in place so that we can create organizational structures that are able to adapt and morph according to context? And one last slide. This is how nature does it. So this is a mycelial network. This is essentially fungi that lives between the roots of trees, that connect different trees in a forest, for example, so that it almost becomes one macroorganism. It allows them to communicate with each other. It allows them to share nutrients. And it's almost like this informal network that connects the different hierarchies. So they live between the tree roots. And so I think a key for us to think about is, how do we create something similar? What is the human system version of mycelia? And I think there's a key for us in understanding how to cultivate and strengthen informal networks. How do we build more connections between the individuals in our organizations? And I think this becomes especially important, but also a bit more difficult now that we are in this environment where we are all working remotely and we are no longer co-located. But I think there are new opportunities available to us now as well. So that was me kind of rushing through the 5 questions. I hope that I gave you enough, that there are some questions of your own brewing, so that I've at least made you curious. And that is my last and final slide, just with some of my contact details if anybody wants to get in touch. And so I'm going to stop sharing, James. And you can let me know if there are any interesting questions for me to respond to. And if I kept to time, I hope I kept to time.
Oh, don't worry. Actually, there are a few more minutes left for you. Wonderful, wonderful presentation and wonderful time management as well. There you have it, folks. As an insight around navigating complexity with very, very interesting uh, ideas around how to navigate the complexity piece, how to kind of like manage yourselves and manage the environment and the organization in itself. So this is now where we enter into the Q&A portion, where you have an opportunity to pose your questions, pose any clarifications, any comments that would be very useful for you as well as for the group. And we highly encourage you to use the chat box. For that, I do have a question, but I want for you guys to start off. We highly encourage you to post your questions into the chat box or even unmute yourselves so you can ask that question to Sonia. Um, who wants to start?
I'm sure after that rushed presentation, there must be many questions. So.
Yes. Okay, let's see. No one has posted yet on the chat, or maybe I can start off um, with a question then, if you don't mind,
Mm-hmm.
Sonia. I've really very impressed with the idea around the ability for humans to have, the sensing, to have the response, the ability to respond, as well as the ability to evolve, and that it ties in very, very tightly into that resilience piece where are we really managing it, or are we here to kind of being resilient over the changes that are happening? And it's very interesting to note because that's from an individual perspective. But if you kind of like scale that into an organization perspective,
Mhm.
in your experience, what is the level of awareness of organizations on this adaptability piece and this complexity piece? And do you think it will take us a longer period to adapt into that kind of navigating complexity, or are we there already?
I think there is more of a realization now that it's needed. But I think part of the problem here is that many of what we've been taught as best practices um, over the last few decades, the drive for efficiency, stripping out
Mm,
our organization of, most of the redundancy, almost making it more homogenized. If it's because it's much easier to manage when things are similar than when you've got a lot of diversity. Um, and there's an interesting tension between the ability to adapt and have resilience and efficiency, because you need to be slightly inefficient to maintain adaptive capacity and resilience. So I think right now there's more of a realization that it's needed. We're seeing more people ask the questions. We're also starting to see many of the large, for example, consulting companies starting to adopt the language of complexity. The problem is that many of the tools and the methods that they use are still the same. They're still the same linear tools. So it's a bit of a long answer to your question, but I think there's more of a realization. Even things like, for example, the emerging need for psychological safety, that is something that many people are talking about at the moment. The word resilience has come in more and more, but I'm not sure that people fully understand the implications of it yet. So if you want, for example, real response ability, it means that you need to, in some way, empower people on the edges of your organization, people on the front line, to be able to make decisions, to be able to think for themselves and not necessarily always have to use a script. And that means letting go of some control, which for some people are really scary. And also, if you're going to invest in resilience and adaptive capacity, it means that you're going to, in the short term, potentially have to spend money and invest in things that you don't need yet. And then that pool with efficiency starts coming in, because then the financial, the finance people in the organization start saying, we need to cut costs. And where do you cut first? It's in this space where you're actually building the ability to prepare for something. So yeah, it is becoming, I think, more. It's becoming more conscious in business, but I think people are grappling with the implications of it.
thank you. Thank you, Sonia. Wonderful, wonderful insight. And I think George and I are along the same lines or same mindset, because he asked, how do we apply this to business? And George, feel free to kind of like add into the chat if you wanted, you wanted a bit more information around it coming from Sonia. In the meantime, I'm going to move to the next question posed by Sharon. Sharon says, will playfulness be perceived as immature and unprofessional in a corporate setting, especially when one holds a senior role? I personally believe a playful and happy place create productivity. What are your insights on that, Sonia?
I think it very much, I guess, depends on the context. Um, I guess it could be perceived as immature and unprofessional, but then that says more about the culture than it says about you. I think playfulness is where imagination and creativity kind of come from. Playfulness brings lightness, which I think is so needed at the moment. And play doesn't necessarily mean, that we're going to play with Legos, although there's this whole, Lego serious play. There's so much research about the importance of play in business. So if it is perceived like that, then it really is a perception. But you can bring playfulness with in many different ways. You can bring playfulness through beauty, even. You can have your people reflect on poetry. You can just what you guys did in the beginning of this session, James, play music when you're waiting for the meeting to start. There are different ways that you can introduce playfulness, even just finding ways to laugh together. But I think this is becoming increasingly important. I'm not sure where you are, Sharon, but here in South Africa, we're essentially seeing an escalating mental health pandemic. People are burning out at rates that we haven't seen before. And bringing playfulness, bringing lightness into the workplace, I think is one of the things that's critical. It won't solve the well-being problem, but at least it creates a slightly more friendly work environment. And another thing that I think is really important is for us to be effective in uncertainty, to be effective in complexity. We, to use a very like a cliche, we need to think outside the box. And bringing your imagination and playfulness is one of the ways that we do that. But we also need to experiment, because we're not really sure what is going on. One of the ways that we can be response able is when we are in complexity, we want to do multiple safe to fail experiments. And you need to have a bit of a playful attitude to be able to do that, because when you're experimenting, when you're trying different things, you will fail. And if you're in a culture that can't tolerate failure, now bringing a playful stance is one of the ways that you can encourage more experimentation, which hopefully in the end will lead to more innovation.
Thank you for that, Sonja.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. We have an interesting question here from Brent, and I think I want to learn from this question as well. In a climate of fear and sense of retribution, some people tend to prefer deferring responsibility to someone else, often someone else perceived of higher seniority. The resistance is a valid experience for the individual and enforced by the system. How do you overcome this? I think he added a bit more. He says, I see companies tend to label themselves as fast paced, where fast is considered value and excess hard work is praised. Endurance of suffering becomes a badge of honor. What can help shift this? I think there's about 2 questions here from Brent.
Yes. Very interesting questions, but hard ones. I always say in complexity, my favorite answer is it depends. And so there isn't one answer to how you overcome or how you shift these things. I'll take your first one. So the whole idea of climates of fear and sense of retribution, very often they are rooted in real experience. Sometimes it's a perception, but very often there are pockets in the organization. There are typically it's linked to management styles, and other times it's linked to what we choose to measure. So some of the places where I would start, one would be, I would map that narrative ecology that we spoke about. I would try and gather stories from people in the organization so that I can have real examples of what experiences are people having that is creating this perception. What does it look like when you make a mistake and you feel that need to, shift responsibility? What are the specific situations that people are experiencing? And then I will use those stories to see, what do I need to change in the environment so that fewer of those things happen, so that fewer of those stories get told? Because some people have the real experience. Others might be in a different part of the organization where they're not having that experience, but these stories tend to permeate. And then it creates like a perception across the whole organization that creates this culture of fear. So I would look, for example, also at what you're measuring. Like, what are your KPIs? In many, many organizations, I find that the way that we measure managers in particular, the way that we measure their performance, creates this culture where they feel that they need to control. It creates a culture where they can become quite punitive. And so very often these things that we measure drive, or they create unintended consequences. So I would look at the stories, I would look at what we're measuring. And then if it does come down to management style, for example, I think then you'd need to look at particular interventions to see how you can shift that. I would look at, for example, the constraints in place in these organizations, like what do the What do the reporting lines look like? But very often a very fruitful place to start is with KPIs, with what you're measuring. Because if I'm a manager and I'm measured on a particular thing, that means that if somebody below me fails, it's going to impact on my measurement. I will be punitive when that happens. And then it drives this whole culture of fear. The second one, in terms of fast-paced, is a very interesting one. You know, I'm not sure if it came along with the agile movement or if the agile movement kind of just amplified it, but there is almost this idea in organizations that speed is, I don't want to say it's worshipped, but, you know, speed is a primary, thing that we need to focus on. We need to go faster. And this is not always true. One of my favorite writers in the space of complexity is a philosopher called Paul Sillier. He was based here in South Africa as well. And he wrote a wonderful piece on the importance of a certain slowness. And there he writes about the role of context. So if I'm cooking a steak, I want to cook it fast over high heat. If I'm cooking a stew, I want to cook it more slowly over a lower heat. And so we don't always want to go fast. Something that I'll contribute here, Alicia Juarero, she introduced me last year to the concept of, different kinds of time. So we've got chronos time, which is chronological time, which is the time that we experience. It's kind of, the linear time. And that's where we want to speed everything up. We want our projects to be delivered faster. We want to be faster than our competition. But there's another kind of time called kairos, which is the opportune time. It's when time and context come together. So when the system is ready for a change, or when it's the right time, to introduce a new product, or whatever the case might be. And I think what happens is, if we are continuously prioritizing going faster in chronos time, we miss kairos moments. We miss these opportune moments when we could have, through a small intervention, created a big shift. And so I'm not sure how you shift that, but it's a very valid point, and I think it's something that is creating toxicity in our culture, because it's also driving completely unrealistic performance targets for people. This need to be so fast all the time.
Very interesting insight. And I think Jean Elvire actually shares your view around that. And she says, complexity is such an interesting and generative topic to deal with, as is our reality. We do have Go ahead,
Can I
Shan.
just say one thing? Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just happy to be here this morning. I was writing that VUCA is an acronym we knew before, now for 20 years or more.
Yes.
And recently, I discovered a new acronym that has been crafted by a German, which is BANI. BANI, which means brittle, anxious, I'm forgetting the end, but non-linear,
Mm-hmm.
and I being incomprehensible. So will you say that time of VUCA is completely over, or that we can still be using the VUCA and just see how we integrate the rest, like the BANI, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. Yeah,
I haven't heard that one yet. Thank you for
I can send you.
that.
I will try and put it in the chat.
Yes, thank you. Please do that.
Please do
And
that, yes.
what you're reminding me of, how do I say your name? Jean?
Yeah, this is okay, Genevieve. This is okay.
Okay. I've got a difficult surname. You've got a difficult first name.
This is fine.
You are reminding me, Aaron Antonovsky is a sociologist, and he's got this theory of sense of coherence.
Yeah.
And he talks about individuals and systems. It's interesting. Many people are now using this, myself included, on an organizational level. you have a sense of coherence when something is comprehensible, so you feel you can make sense of it. It's manageable, so you can cope with it, and it's meaningful, so you're motivated to engage with it. And it's really interesting, this idea of incomprehensibility. I think especially at the start of the pandemic, there were several people who were really challenged by, I just don't know how to make sense. And that created this anxiety, in human beings, which then created the brittleness to some extent in the systems. And now what's interesting is we're seeing more people almost move towards being challenged on the level of meaningfulness. It's fascinating how it's almost as if being confronted with how brittle, I guess, our lives are, how fragile our lives are. People are really questioning, do I want to be climbing this corporate ladder? Do I want to be doing this job forever? And now we're seeing more and more people resigning out of these organizations because of a struggle with meaning. So thank you so much for contributing that, Jean.
And just
Alvia.
one more thing, I wanted to say that I'm so much interested in the subject that I'm trying to see how I can work with complexity in the field of supervision. And I'm trying to work on it now. And if you will agree, then I can let you know what we are doing, a colleague of mine. And then if you can just tell us what you think about what we are doing, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. You can send it to me. You have my email address. Feel free.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alvia. And thank you as well for Brent and Natasha for sharing us more information around the sense of coherence. So there's the Bani, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. We do have a follow-through question coming from George. And this is a really straightforward question, Sonja. At what size does a system become complex or chaotic?
It's not necessarily size related, George. A family is complex. So a typical family, mother, father, or mother, mother, and two children is already complex. It's the moment that there are non-linear interdependencies, the moment there are these connections that happen, things become unpredictable. Also, human systems. Dave Snowden talks about the 3 I's in human systems. So humans have intelligence, intentionality, and we navigate multiple identities or multiple roles. And so in a way, you're never entirely sure what role you are interacting with. So humans kind of bring complexity, just with them because, we are complex. But complexity, so the more interconnected things become. So even if so people, for example, would already be a complex system, with the people who are in there. The moment they partner, for example, with 2 other small consultancies, it becomes even more, that becomes more complex. So it's not about the size necessarily, it's about the number and the nature of connections. So it arises from how things connect, not necessarily from the things themselves. And so the more connections, the more complex. Chaotic is, in our language, so I'm not an expert in chaos theory, but, from a, for example, a Cynefin framework perspective, I don't know if you're familiar with that, so Cynefin distinguishes between ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. We would say that chaos is a temporary state, and it happens when things become unconnected, when all of a sudden the patterns that existed in the complex system dissolves. So it tends to be a space of crisis. Typically, so when there's a financial collapse, directly after that, you've got chaos. In the beginning of the pandemic, when everybody was scrambling, nobody knew what was going on, there may have been chaotic moments, but a system does not stay in chaos because it's a state of being unconstrained and things being random. So again, it's got nothing to do with size necessarily. It's got to do with the context and how things are constrained. And when constraints dissolve and we can no longer see patterns and things are in crisis, that is when you fall into chaos. But I think chaos theorists might have a different definition of that.
Thank you for that, Sonja. And we have a few more minutes left, to be exact, around 5 minutes. And this is an opportunity for everyone to, we don't have anyone in the chat anymore. So anyone in the group, you can actually unmute yourselves and pose a question to Sonja. Going once? Going twice? All right. So on that note, there we have it. Fresh insights coming from navigating complexity, coming from our very special guest and expert, Sonja Blignaut. As we say our thanks to the people who brought this event to reality, we're flashing a QR code to invite you to tell us what you think of this event. We will also be posting it into the chat box. So folks from our People team will be posting that link to the chat box as well as flashing the QR code on screen. And while we're doing this, on this note, a first thank you goes to Sonja for a wonderful, wonderful session on navigating complexity today. The next thank you is to all People colleagues who brought this event to reality. And a final thank you to you, our audience, for breathing life into our Agony Expert series. And we highly encourage and invite you to check out our other Agony Expert sessions for the whole month of August. And before we close out, anyone else who would like to share a comment or say any comments? Nat?
No, I don't. But I have a question for Sonja. Sonja, what do you think of this new acronym? Brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. I find it very interesting, actually.
Yeah, I was just responding in the chat, Natasha. I find it interesting, but then on the other hand, I find it slightly, to my mind, it mixes. It feels a bit like it mixes responses to something with descriptions of something. So if that makes sense, so anxiety, for example, is a response to something being incomprehensible. Brittleness arises when, so complex systems aren't necessarily brittle, but they are volatile and uncertain and potentially incomprehensible. They're definitely non-linear. So it feels a bit like a mix, so when you don't deal properly with complexity, you might become brittle. When you're confronted with it, you become anxious. But then non-linearity and incomprehensibility are almost descriptions of the system. So I find it really interesting. I'd love to read a bit more about it, but that's my first response is, so VUCA, so volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. They're all descriptions of a context. This seems to be mixing descriptions of a context with descriptions of the response to the context, if that makes sense.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I was just looking it up, actually.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that complex systems are always, and I'm not sure if this is a description of complexity, so that's why I say I need to look at it more. But they are definitely ambiguous, but they're not always incomprehensible. They have patterns. You can discern patterns, so you can kind of make sense of them. They're not completely incomprehensible. So I'm not sure what the acronym is describing. So that also makes me, why I'd like to read up a bit more about it and see what it's all about.
I have just put a link in the chat box. It was a little bit difficult for me to do it, but normally you should get the article with the link I have put in the chat box.
Thank you. Now I'm looking forward to reading it.
Yeah.
All right, and thank you as well for sharing that, Elvira, as well as Nat for sharing the information. And apologies, we missed out your question as well coming from the chat. Um, any other last minute questions before we close out? Luisa actually just mentioned brilliant, was an amazing experience to me personally. Thoroughly enjoyed the session. Looking forward to the next one. And
Thank
on
you.
that note, again, you would like to say, oh, sorry, Nat, I think was about to say something.
No, I was just gonna say, please give us your feedback, everybody. There's a link there that you can click on. Just give us a couple minutes. Thanks.
There you have it. All right. So on that note, to everyone, we would like to say thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you again in our expert series. Thank you so much, Sonja, for this wonderful, wonderful session. And we will see everyone in the next sessions as well. So this is James Porticos in behalf of P Pearl team and behalf of Sonja as well. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your afternoons, evenings, and mornings. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.